Hello and welcome, my name is Chris from ChristopherHole.com and welcome to this video where we're going to be talking about hamstring, quadriceps and adductor strain. Now first of all we'll talk about what it is, then we'll look at some potential, then we'll look at the anatomy, then some potential causes and then some treatment methods that you could be thinking about. So first of all, a hamstring, quadricep and adductor strain is a tear or partial tear of the group of muscles. Now, if you've watched a previous video of mine on muscle injuries, I overview what tear and partial tears are, so you'll have a kind of better understanding of what that means. For the purposes of this video, because we're focusing more on the tissues themselves and the specific injury themselves, I won't go through what the tear or partial tear is. You can go back and have a look at that video and you can enlighten yourself on that information as well. So obviously the anatomy is quite simple. You've got the quadriceps on the front of the leg, you've got the hamstrings on the back of the leg, you've got the abductors on the outside of the leg, and then you've got the adductors on the inside of the leg. So we're looking at hamstrings on the back, quadriceps on the front, and adductors up the middle. Some potential causes is overstretching or overloading of the muscles. Now these would generally be sort of like an overuse, repetitive type of injury. You can overstretching, you can tear the muscle, so that would be more traumatic. So if for whatever reason you went into a splits position and you couldn't stop yourself going down and the muscle tore, that would be a traumatic. But if it's overloading, it would generally be a sort of repetitive, and then one adverse lift further down the line through a weakened tissue can cause a strain. An unaccustomed activity, cramp or non-rehabilitated previous injury. And basically a non-rehabilitated previous injury is just a weakened tissue that's possibly got a lot of scar tissue around that hasn't been properly recovered and properly built back up. So they're just basically left vulnerable to overloading and possibly overstretching as well. So that would fall into the traumatic injury category. So what we then go on to are the treatments. So eventually, once the initial injury will obviously need rest, ice, compression, elevation, possibly police, which adds in the optimal loading, which again, if you want to know what those mean, go back and watch my rice and police video and you'll find out what those are. But then when we come on to more prolonged rehabilitation, once you've done the initial phase, you would look at stretching the muscle, foam rolling the muscle, massaging the muscle. Now you would want to do that obviously when a muscle tears, scar tissue lays itself down, it will become slightly tighter. So the stretching, the foam rolling and the massage will help disperse the scar tissue and allow the muscle tissue to sort of work back in to do its job that it's there to do. And then the final sort of part would be then strengthening the tissues and loading the tissues and moving the tissues so they are able to recognize that or they're able to recognize the job that they are supposed to do. What a lot of people do is they don't do the strengthening and they don't do the moving and they don't do the optimal loading because they think they're going to re-injure. But as long as you do it appropriately, then the strengthening of the tissue will come back, and to some degree it can come back even stronger depending on how well you do it. So just to go back over what we've talked about, you've got your hamstrings on the back of the leg here, you've got the quads on the front of the leg here, and you've got the adductors on the inside of the leg here. It's a partial tear of the muscle group, so it could be a partial tear of the quad, the hamstring, or the adductor. Potential causes, generally traumatic from overstretching and overloading, but can have like a repetitive nature to it because that can weaken the tissues. But unaccustomed activity, cramp, and non-rehabilitated previous injury. Then we have, as a treatment, first of all, rest, ice, compression, elevation, or police with optimal loading. Then in a more prolonged rehabilitation approach would be stretching, foam rolling, massaging, and strengthening slash optimal loading of tissues. So hopefully that's been useful. Hopefully it's given you some ideas and some avenues to explore when rehabilitating your injury or your condition. So my name is Chris from christopherhall.com, and I'll speak to you in a future video.